Welcome to A Slice of Medieval. In today's episode, Derek and I are going to look at Richard, Duke of York, and try and answer the question as to whether or not he was a loyal lord or a traitorous knave. So first, I suppose we'd better look into who exactly was Richard, Duke of York, and how closely was he related to the crown. So Richard was the son of Richard of Conisbrough, the Earl of Cambridge, and Anne Mortimer. And his parents actually married without permission. It was a secret marriage.
There was a reason for that.
Well, we'll get to that in a sec. Through his mother, he was descended from Lionel of Antwerp, second son of Edward III. And through his father, he was descended from Edmund of Langley, fourth son of Edward III. His father, Richard of Conisbrough, was executed for treason in 1415. His mum had already died in about 1412 or 1413. Richard was born on 22nd of December 1411. So by the age of 4, he had lost both parents. And his father had been attainted for treason. So his prospects from the age of 4 did not look very promising.
No, the thing that always, it doesn't amuse me, but it does interest me, is the fact that his father was executed in what's referred to as the Southampton plot. And the idea of the Southampton plot was to put the Mortimer heir, the Earl of March, on the throne. And the person who told the king, Henry V, about this plot was the Mortimer heir, the Earl of March. So it was a bit of a daft thing, really, that the revelation of the plot, I guess, was self-preservation on the part of the Earl of March. But it is rather ironic. It's unusual, to say the least. I mean, you do get people sometimes confessing under torture and dropping their conspirators in it, but normally it doesn't quite happen in that way. But anyway, as you said, he's basically orphaned and he becomes a royal ward. But he's got this pedigree, as you said, he's got this dual descent from Edward III. And that lineage will be what defines him, really, as far as history is concerned in the end. But at this stage, in the late 14s, early 1420s, he's a ward and obviously has no control over his own future at that point.
Now, when his dad was executed in the summer of 1415, his future was looking quite bleak. Richard of Conisbrough, as Earl of Cambridge, was known as the poorest earl in the kingdom. He had little to no lands of his own. He lived at Conisbrough Castle on sufferance of his older brother, Edward, Duke of York. So Richard wasn't actually going to inherit an awful lot from his father. But luckily for him, his uncle, Edward, the Duke of York, had extensive lands and no son. So he became Edward's heir, and no one prevented him from inheriting the Dukedom of York when Edward died at Agincourt in October 1415.
Well, yeah, but he didn't get those lands for quite some time till he was in his majority, did he? So, I mean, at that point, he's a royal ward, and his wardship is, I think, sold to Ralph Neville, who I think was Earl of Westmoreland, if I remember right.
He was Earl of Westmoreland.
Now, Ralph Neville's a big deal,
Yeah.
isn't he, to an extent? I mean, he's a powerful presence in the north of England.
But you can tell how valuable the York lands were, because Neville paid, I think it was £3,000 for Richard's wardship. Because when we talk about wardship, we look at it as, looking after the children. These people are underage, so they need substitute parents. But wardship also included looking after the lands. And whilst the child was underage, the revenue from any lands that child possessed went into the coffers of the person holding the wardship.
Yeah.
So it was a very valuable wardship in that Ralph Neville, yes, he got Richard, Duke of York, who he could marry off to one of his daughters, but he was also administering York's lands and taking the revenues from those lands whilst he was still underage.
Yes, and of course, a critical thing in terms of York's inheritance and the lands he had was that he also inherited the Mortimer family estates and lands, which were huge
Yes.
in the Welsh Marches and so on. And the combination of the York inheritance and the Mortimer inheritance meant that he was the wealthiest nobleman in England when he eventually came of age. So, as a prospect, if you wanted somebody to be a guardian of, then he was the man, he was the boy.
Yes.
And of course, he marries Ralph Neville's daughter, Cecily, which obviously it's a very well-known marriage alliance. What did she bring to the table, do you think?
Well, she also, as you know, had royal links because she was the granddaughter of John of Gaunt and Catherine Swynford. And her mother, Joan, had given birth to something like 16 or 17 children.
Definitely a lot.
Cecily was the youngest.
Yeah.
Because of the royal links through Joan Beaufort, Ralph basically disinherited his son by his first wife in order to leave most of his movable goods and lands to his sons by his second semi-royal wife. And it actually started a massive feud that didn't get resolved until after Joan Beaufort's death between the two families. The eldest son got the earldom of Westmoreland, but nothing to actually survive on.
Probably a lot of people don't realise is that within the Neville family, there was as big a feud as probably between the Percys and the Nevilles.
Yes.
Because they were on opposite sides a lot of the time as the years go by. There was quite a lot of rancour there, wasn't there?
Yeah, you look at actually the families, Cecily's sisters and who they married. They were on both sides of what would be the Wars of the Roses. You know, her sister Anne was married to the Lancastrian Duke of Buckingham. Her sister Catherine, I think it was married to the Duke of Norfolk, who was on the Yorkist side.
The problem with the Wars of the Roses is the temptation, which we all eventually succumb to plant back in time things which wouldn't have made sense to anybody. So, for example, we can't talk about Yorkist and Lancastrian at this time that we're talking about at the moment. The marriages that Ralph Neville made for his daughters were the best he could make, basically. So what he was trying to do was ensure his dynasty, his family would get all the right connections. So the fact that one daughter was married to Buckingham, another one to Norfolk or whatever, and another one to York, it is just him building up a network of alliances.
Yeah.
I see it so many times today. People said, oh, well, he was so-and-so's brother-in-law, so they were obviously on the same side. I mean, it's just ludicrous.
Yes.
Because it doesn't work that way. So any connections made by marriage are only as good as the advantages to the individuals concerned.
The strength with Richard, Duke of York, we mentioned he'd inherited the lands of the Duke of York and the Mortimer lands. Those lands were spread throughout England. He didn't have the landed power base like the Earl of Warwick did at Middleham.
Where he in the end based himself was at Wigmore in the Welsh Marches. I mean, that was a really strong Mortimer area, massively strong. So he had a base.
I think that's the thing, isn't it? It was the Mortimer lands.
Yeah, definitely. And he saw that as his fiefdom, that was his place. I mean, this is another anomaly. Although he's Duke of York, his connections with York are pretty tenuous, and he wasn't always that much supported by the city of York, or even people. I mean, the people of Yorkshire, if they supported any great lord, it was a Neville or a Percy.
Yeah.
The Duke of York, as you said, didn't really have a power base in the north.
No, I mean, he did have Conisbrough Castle. He did have Sandal Castle in Wakefield, but that was right next to Pontefract Castle, which was owned by the Duchy of Lancaster.
Yeah.
And had more extensive lands there than York did.
Okay, so he has a not very promising start in life, but things look up, and by I think about 1432, he comes into his adulthood and he inherits himself all of this land and the income from it and so on. So at that point, from 1432 onwards, he is a player in the game nationally. He is the wealthiest nobleman, and he has, as we've said, this lineage from Edward III, from two branches of Edward III's descendants. So he is a very, very potentially, let's say, a very powerful nobleman. But he's also quite young then.
Yeah, but he was being groomed for that throughout the 1420s. You know, he'd married Cecily Neville in 1424, was knighted in 1426, joined the royal household in 1428. And in 1430, he'd gone to France with the king, young Henry VI,
Yeah.
and taken part in his coronation
Yeah.
in France as King of France. So he's being groomed already to take over the responsibilities.
Yeah, I think what we need to remember is that he's not being groomed for anything by Henry VI, because Henry VI is still young. And if York has any advancement at all, it's down to people like Henry V's brother, the Duke of Bedford, and then later the Duke of Suffolk, and so on. It's down to those around Henry VI
Yes.
at this point. And the focal point of the reign is nothing to do with Yorkists, Lancastrians, possession of the throne. All of that is nothing, non-existent. All everybody's thinking about is the war with France. That is the big focus, isn't it?
Yes.
Of that of the 1430s and 1440s into the 1450s. It's the war with France. It's the biggest single issue the nation is dealing with. And York is involved in that. He's heavily invested in the French wars. Invested being a good word.
Yeah, well, he learns his soldiering in France,
Yeah.
doesn't he? And his command. You know, he takes on political and military command in France.
Yeah, it's both his success story and his sort of Achilles heel as well. I mean, he gets a royal appointment in 1440 as the king's lieutenant in France. He's basically been there earlier in the late 1430s, but this is a sort of official appointment, and it carries obviously enormous responsibility. And he's appointed for 5 years, and he's pretty successful overall. And it's worth mentioning at this point, and we may mention it again, I don't know. The reason any of the English commanders in France are successful has got less to do with them and more to do with John Talbot, who was the single greatest English general in the 100 Years' War after the death of Henry V. So any successes are usually down to Talbot. Before the end of the 5 years, York was being undermined. In 1443, John Beaufort was appointed to a similar role in Gascony. So as York is the king's lieutenant in France, and John Beaufort is the king's lieutenant in Gascony. Now, Beaufort is appointed for 7 years, and he's given £25,000 to fund his war effort. How much was York given? 0. York funded his war effort from his own wealth, and this really rankled with him. So the crown was massively in debt to York for all his expenses during the French war. Later, John Beaufort was replaced by Edmund Beaufort, and just to rub a bit of salt in the wound, Edmund Beaufort in 1448 was made Duke of Somerset. Now, to York, this looked like somebody being rewarded for being a total abysmal failure. I mean, I think that's very much York's perspective, and I don't think we should necessarily accept York's perspective on anything as being fact. But it was certainly true that York had been more successful than either of the Beauforts in France. But then the situation in France was changing as well. So the French were getting stronger. So you know, it's not as if you're measuring something against the same degree of enemy, as it were. So
yes,
this is where the York-Beaufort rivalry starts, in a sense. But maybe before we go any further, we need to sort of widen it out. Say, okay, well, never mind France for a minute. What was York's perspective on what happens if the king dies without an heir, which at that point, in the 1440s, Henry VI might die childless. Now, if he died childless, who would succeed? Now, York, as the leading nobleman, but also someone with a very, very good claim on the strength of his lineage from Edward III, wanted to be seen as the heir presumptive. The man who, if things go badly for the crown, will take over as king. Now, again, that's York's perspective. There's no question that that's what he thought. He wasn't saying he wanted the crown from Henry. Henry was the rightful king. No dispute at all. at any point about that. But York was saying, okay, well, if the wheels fall off, I'm here, I'm the man, and I want to be recognised as the one who will take over. Now, you sense that the appointment of the Beauforts is a response to that. One of the things we know is that the Beauforts had been steadfastly loyal to Henry V and VI. And there's no reason to doubt that they would continue to be loyal to Henry VI. So if you're Henry VI, looking at it from his perspective rather than Richard Duke of York, you see maybe other possibilities other than Richard Duke of York as your heir presumptive. And the Beaufort descendants of John of Gaunt are a possibility. It's no stronger than that.
There's always this argument, isn't there, that they were barred from the throne because the Act of Parliament that legitimised them has this little bit written in saying accepting the royal dignity.
Yeah.
That was inserted at some time, but no one seems to know whether it was inserted at the time.
No.
Or later by some nefarious act. And if it wasn't inserted at the time, if it was something that was done later that the Beauforts may not even have known about, then they quite likely, seeing themselves as the nearest blood relations to Henry VI, would see themselves as a viable option for the throne.
Yeah, there's a big difference between the Beauforts and York, and the big difference is the Beauforts have not a great deal of land behind them at all, and therefore not a great deal of wealth. So the more Henry VI heaps upon the Beauforts, and particularly Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, the more he gets from Henry VI, the more worried York is about this rising star, this rising Beaufort star at court. Nobody's saying that these two are rivals. It's just that they are two of the most prominent people there, but they're not in charge at that point. In the 1440s,
no,
the man in charge is the Duke of Suffolk. And so it's not as if, they're already in power, as it were. York sees this upstart and incompetent Edmund Beaufort as a potential rival.
Yeah.
But in the 1440s, they don't get on, but they're not in a position to rock the boat at all, really.
No. And Henry VI is still young. He's still in his 20s. There's still a possibility that he will turn out to be the king that his father was.
Yes.
And can hold these factions together. I mean, it's not looking promising.
He's married to Margaret of Anjou by then and could easily have an heir.
Especially when you think Richard Duke of York, his and Cecily's children weren't born until a good few years after the marriage, the first child, wasn't it? So
yeah, exactly. And that comparison has been made, that the fact that you don't have any children immediately doesn't mean you're not going to have lots of them.
No.
So by the end of the 1440s, the war in France has been dragging on, and there's some attempts here and there at possibly having a peace treaty, but nothing really comes to anything. And the war just basically drags on, and it's a drain on the country. And it has adverse effects on the country for that reason. Now, in 1450, a lot of these concerns come to a head in a rebellion in Kent, which is called Jack Cade's Rebellion, led by a chap called Jack Cade.
Oh, and you mean not Richard Duke of York?
No, not Richard Duke of York, no.
Because isn't that one of the things laid at his feet, that he instigated this rebellion?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is a popular rebellion. It's possible that someone like York, who was even then a pretty good propagandist, it's possible that the things he did and said may have made things worse. But basically, it was a popular uprising. And the vehemence with which that rebellion arrived in London certainly bears that out. There's a real anger there. It's a very destructive rebellion, and ultimately it causes the end of a number of crown ministers, not least the Duke of Suffolk himself, who is murdered shortly afterwards. So it's important because it shows that things are going wrong, let's say, within England. They're war weary, let's say.
Well, war has an effect on the everyday life of people not involved in it. You know, trade is stilted and limited by it. Travel is reduced. It's not like it's a distant war that doesn't involve the ordinary person in England. Oh yeah, and taxes are raised to pay for it.
Armies are mustered, and where do they come from? Well, they come from ordinary men and boys with their bows or their pikes. So it's important for that reason, but it's also important because it creates a power vacuum at the centre of government, because it removes the Duke of Suffolk and a few of his cronies. It means that suddenly you need to press the reset button because the government's gone. Henry VI is now having to cope with what happens next. And this is a critical moment, I think, in the career of York.
Yeah.
Because what happens next at this very moment when York is probably thinking, well, this is a good time for me to throw my hat in the ring, heir presumptive, leading nobleman, to take a leading role in government. That doesn't happen because Henry VI sends him to Ireland as Lord Deputy, I think, of Ireland in 1448, I think, or 1449, he's told. He delays and delays going because he really doesn't want to go. Why doesn't he want to go? Because Ireland is a graveyard for English politicians. He's out of the loop in Ireland. And you may say, okay, so why does Henry send York to Ireland? Is it a positive appointment that he thinks York's a good choice? Or is it a negative appointment that he wants to get him out of England?
A bit of both, probably. York was technically, he's the senior nobleman and the most experienced military and political commander that Henry VI has got. He is a good choice to send to Ireland, but it also means that he's out, like you say, he's out of the loop in the politics in England, which is where the main theatre is.
Technically, he was an Irish lord as well. He had an earldom in Ireland. So if you're Henry, or if you're thinking of a good person to send who has Irish links, York does fit the bill. But that kind of ignores, the elephant in the room, as it were. So you can see it either way. Whether it was the best man for the job or not, he really didn't like it.
No, because it took him away from main events. Even France would have been a better option because it was seen as so much more important.
Yeah, and in France, you've got a big army at your back. Although the way things go in France in the next few years, probably it's not the best place to be. No. Yeah, so it's a pivotal moment in York's career. York very, very dissatisfied. He's got the hump, basically, in a big way.
Well, he's put all his resources, personal resources, into helping to keep control of France.
Yeah.
And now he's being sent to Ireland to do the same there, again with his own resources.
Yeah, and he's still owed massive amounts of money. I think he was originally owed about £40,000 by the Crown for his work in France. But then the only way he gets any of that paid back to him is by writing off most of it. So he does feel that he's got the butt end of things. He's been treated badly. And I think that feeds York's character a little bit.
Yes.
York has a great belief in what his role should be. And the worst thing he can do to somebody like that is to kick them in the teeth and send them away. Because it festers with them that they've been badly treated.
And he's also, like you say, he sees himself as heir presumptive. So he also sees himself being sent to Ireland as being moved out of the way so that others can possibly make that claim.
Yeah, it's not about the throne at the moment. What it's about in the next decade, what it will be about is control of the King's Council. Because by 1450, everybody at court is totally aware that Henry VI is not Henry V. Henry VI is never going to be able to control things himself. He can make decisions, usually with unerring ability to make the wrong decision, but nevertheless, he's not an idiot as such.
The people around him with influence, they were the ones who were guiding Henry's decisions.
But again, it's important to give some perspective here. Every single king of any country, but in England included, had factional differences within their court. People don't agree. They follow their own needs.
Yes.
But a king has to be able to control those.
And that's the sign of a strong king, being able to balance the factions.
Yeah. So York is then faced with being sort of out of the loop, and he doesn't like it.
He would have seen it as an exile as well, wouldn't he?
Yeah, he would have seen it as an exile, undoubtedly, but I think also maybe one or two others would have as well.
Yes.
But I don't think in 1450 there was a great deal of animosity against York or against Somerset. I don't think that really existed until something like September 1450, when York comes back to England. He's not supposed to come back to England until he's summoned.
Yes.
He's supposed to be in Ireland. He comes back to England and he comes with armed men all the way to London. And, you can't dress that up as anything other than trying as a threatening move.
Yes.
Not a threatening move to get the throne at all, but a threatening move to say, look, I can't be ignored. And so basically he's taking up arms against the crown, and whatever side you want to take. That's basically what he was doing.
Yeah.
Now, the reason he did it in a way is that York was something of a populist. He was popular in the House of Commons, kind of figurehead for reform of all the ills and problems that the country had. And he played on that enormously. So York comes in September 1450 as the kind of people's champion to demand reform at court and so on and so forth. Trouble is, there's no other nobleman that agrees with him. The great thing about York is he doesn't actually realise that until he gets to London in September 1450 and sort of says, "Here I am, guys." He rips off his shirt and reveals the Superman T-shirt underneath. "Here I am, the saviour of the nation." And the nobles are saying, "You're out of order, mate," basically. It's another humiliation for him, really, because lots of things are promised and he goes away and not much changes, basically. Somerset is still in power, if you like, still got the ear of Henry VI, and York is still out of favour. So despite taking up arms, obviously, whilst at the same time saying, well, I've no problem with the king, it's just these evil councillors. That's a good cop out, isn't it?
And nobody's heard that argument before, have they?
No, not since either.
Isn't that something that they said in the Peasants' Revolt? It's not the king, it's the evil councillors.
Yeah, it's always the evil councillors.
Never blame the king, it's always the councillors.
There must be a conveyor belt of evil councillors going around. York's a trier, basically, because in 1452 he does almost exactly the same thing. He collects an army, and this time the king's forces are raised as well. And so you've kind of got armed forces in London facing each other, but it's not a civil war because there's only one side, basically, and that's the king. York is, again, completely isolated. Anybody we might talk about later as being an ally of York is not an ally of York in 1452. He's certainly not doing himself any favours. He's not making himself more liked or approved of by the other councillors.
Is it that York can't read the room, or that he's talking to people and they're saying one thing to his face and one thing behind his back?
No, I don't think he's got any support, tacit or otherwise. I think he doesn't read the room. It's as simple as that. It's one of his fatal flaws that he doesn't read the room, and we'll see plenty of examples of that. Again, he's got a choice. He's got this armed force. What's he going to do? Start a war against the king in London? When every other noble of consequence is on the king's side? It's not going to happen. So he has to surrender again. If you're a political commentator at the beginning of 1453, you're saying, Duke of York, who's he? I mean, he's yesterday's man. He's gone. He has no future whatsoever in English politics.
Making mistake upon mistake, isn't he? So and ending up in the wilderness. And
then it gets worse in 1453, because in 1453, the Queen's pregnant. And the prospect of a son for Henry VI is very much in everyone's mind.
Yeah. It's obvious that Margaret can have children. So even if this one isn't a son, it's only a matter of time until a son arrives.
Exactly.
Suddenly there's a dynasty ahead from Henry VI. It's like even if he isn't on the throne, there's going to be a son or a child.
Yeah. So we don't really it's not urgent to have an heir presumptive, because probably won't need one anyway, the way things are going.
And then things take a turn.
Well, I mean, the summer of 1453 is a bit exciting. The Queen gives birth, but even more exciting than that, if it's difficult to believe, England suffers a major reverse in the French War, a reverse at the Battle of
Yes.
Castillon in the summer, where Talbot, the great English general and warrior, is killed. And it's kind of one of those those moments in national life, partly because of the catastrophic defeat, but also because your hero is dead and you can't see where you go from there.
Yeah, there's no other great general in the
No.
wings who's done similar, who can take on the reins of command.
Yeah, exactly. So that summer is critical in lots of ways, and we don't know exactly what tipped Henry VI over the edge, but it's suggested that the defeat and death of John Talbot was possibly the main reason. Rather unkindly, it has been suggested at times it was the idea that his wife was actually going to have a child, but I think that's just gossip.
Yeah.
I think it was this big defeat, and obviously his own temperament and whatever problems he was susceptible to. But the long and short of it is that he went into something of a catatonic trance and couldn't be shaken out of it. His wife gave birth to a son, the much longed for son. He was totally unaware of it. And this sort of threw the whole court into chaos.
Yeah, because you can't have a king who can't make decisions. You need somebody
No.
to make a decision, and you can't just say, oh, we'll wait for the king to wake up, because it dragged on.
Government grinds to a halt because it's a personal monarchy still.
Yes.
There is a parliament, but parliament is summoned by the king for the king.
Yeah. And it only met infrequently. It wasn't there every day doing the job.
No. There's no mechanism for the government to function without a king. I always feel sorry for the councillors, to be honest, because this is a nightmare. This man is not responding to anybody. He's not dead, which would be easier. He's still alive.
And he's still eating and drinking. He's still being fed. He's still able to eat and drink.
He's functioning as a human being.
Yeah.
But he's unresponsive, and they try numerous times to talk to him and to say, what do you want to do about this? What do you want to do about that? And then the Chancellor dies. Now, this is not the Chancellor of the Exchequer that we know of today, obviously. This is the Lord Chancellor, who is kind of a key figure in government, the head of the legal system, but also one of the key offices of state. And he dies. Now, only the king can appoint a new one. So you've not only not got a king, but you now haven't got the leading subject of the government.
Yeah, he's basically the head of the civil service.
Yeah.
He's what keeps everything moving.
Yeah, exactly. While you've got a Lord Chancellor, the country can kind of run on autopilot, following previous procedures and so on. Nothing new can happen. No decisions can be made, no big ones anyway.
No, but the law courts can still run, taxes can still be raised.
Yeah, but the death of the Lord Chancellor means the council have to do something. They can't ignore it anymore. And they make numerous attempts, as I said, to talk to Henry VI to hopefully he'll suddenly, regain his faculties, but he doesn't. And then they've got a decision to make. And the decision is to appoint a protector of the realm, someone to have the powers of the king, kind of first among equals in the council, but who isn't king and has no rights to the throne as such, but they are caretaker. Now, the reason you can appoint a caretaker is because you have actually got an heir. With the birth of young Prince Edward to Margaret of Anjou, you've got a future still. But if you're the council, you're thinking, well, how long is this protector going to be in place? The prince is about less than one. He's not going to come of age for at least 14 years. So whoever you appoint has got to be in it for the long haul. He's got to be in that role for some time, possibly. I mean, the king might die, or the king might live on, and then either way, you're dealing with the son or the father. It doesn't matter. At this point, you haven't got a functioning monarch. And if the king stays in that state forever, it's 14 years, minimum 14 years, and possibly quite a bit longer. before you have a new king. Who do you appoint to that role, which is clearly going to be massive, absolutely massive? Whoever you appoint is going to control everything. They're going to control patronage, they're going to control appointments, war and peace, all the things a king does, that person will do. So it's also, however, a bit of a poison chalice for the person who takes it on, because you've got all the power of the king, but no actual rights of the king. So if you do something and other people don't like it, the council have appointed them. Council can unappoint them. They can overthrow them and appoint somebody else. So you've got no longevity of the role. So if you make a real hash of it, you're going to be out. But equally, even if you are protector for the next 15 years, when the new king comes along, he's got no reason necessarily to reward you, compensate you, to give you high office or anything. So in the short term, it's a good role to have, but the longer it goes on, the less helpful it is for you as an individual. So that's why I think it's a poison chalice. So not everybody you would think would want that role. Who are the candidates, would we say, for that?
Margaret of Anjou thought herself the rightful candidate. She thought that she had the right to be regent. Because she was the mother of the heir. I mean, she'd grown up in France. In France, they did have this tradition of female regents during minorities.
Well, in Anjou in particular.
But we didn't have that tradition in England.
Margaret of Anjou has got a lot of stick historically, and we've talked about her before, and I think there's a lot to defend her. But I think it's often supposed that the council were dead against her being regent. I don't think that's the case at all.
No.
I think it was a serious possibility, and they considered it seriously. I don't think it was rejected out of hand. She had been at the centre of government now for some time, and whilst it may not have been ideal, and let's face it, the whole culture was against the idea of women having power in the first place, but I mean, it was a possibility.
And the argument, I suppose, technically would have been, we're at war and she can't lead armies. So we need someone who understands military as much as civil law and practice.
Yeah, of course, a little voice might have piped up that Henry VI couldn't lead armies either.
Well, yes.
but yes, it's a fair point. Now, the other obvious candidate is the Duke of Somerset, Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, in pole position, you'd have thought. He's the most powerful man at court. He's had control of the government for a year or two, almost the man in possession, you might say. He's the most likely.
Yeah, and he's technically Henry's choice because he's the man already doing the job.
Yeah, that's right. Now, there is another candidate who puts himself forward, who I regard as something of a joke candidate, Henry Holland, Duke of Exeter, who also had royal blood in his veins.
Yes.
He thought he'd be terrific in the job. That's because he was an idiot. Everybody else knew he wouldn't be terrific in the job. Yeah. He was dismissed out of hand. But then, in the background, got this other guy that we've dismissed in the past, leading nobleman, wealthiest nobleman, impeccable lineage.
Yeah, also governed in France and governed in Ireland, so he had experience of government.
Yeah, experienced. Yeah,
and with the people.
Popular in Parliament, which could be helpful. But none of those choices are a foregone conclusion. I think, we make a mistake if we assume that one of those was inevitable. I don't think York was inevitable. I think the councillors had an enormously difficult job. Now, that's not the whole story, is it really? Because in the background of all of that, in 1453 and 1454, there is another story going on, which has got absolutely nothing to do with Henry VI and the court, and has got everything to do with the north of England. Because in 1453, the Neville family and the Percy family are at each other's throat, almost literally.
Well, literally, wasn't there an ambush after a wedding?
A skirmish between Neville and Percy factions at a place called Helworth Moor, I think. You might be. Is that how you say it? Helworth Moor?
Yeah, Heworth.
Heworth Moor. Right, okay. And that's just the start of it, really. I mean, that This rivalry is ages old, it's centuries old, but it comes to a head in 1453 at the precise moment that the council are trying to deliberate on who should rule instead of Henry VI. So we can't ignore it because there are some heavyweight councillors directly involved. They become the usual suspects in the next few years, but you've got Richard, Earl of Salisbury, who is the brother-in-law of the Duke of York, Richard Neville, Earl of Salisbury, and you've got his son, Richard Neville, also confusingly, Earl of Warwick. Now, Warwick rivals York for land holdings due to his marriage. He's a very powerful man with lands everywhere. So you've got two key members of the council are Nevilles. On the other hand, you've got the Earl of Northumberland, and you've got some who might align themselves a bit with him. Earl of Northumberland being the head of the Percy family.
Yes.
So within the council, you've got factions. They're not just political factions, they're actually fighting each other. Not in a huge scale, but it's an ongoing, literally a bloody fight.
Yeah.
It's not a question of people slinging insult. They're slinging other things at each other and killing each other.
Well, it would also have been seen by the common people as a breakdown in central government that these two forces, these two families are fighting. Because if you've got a strong central government and people in charge, then it doesn't happen because they know that they'll face consequences. But with the king in a catatonic state and the council undecided as to who's going to take over whilst the king is in a catatonic state, everybody's taking opportunity to grab a bit of land, settling old scores.
Yeah, I mean, this was happening elsewhere. It wasn't just the Nevilles and the Percys. There was disputes all over the place. To be fair to York, this is one of the planks of his campaign, his propaganda campaign consistently, is that there's a breakdown of law and order and he's the man to sort it out. So I guess when the council decide, heavily influenced by Salisbury and Warwick, when they decide to appoint York, they are basically saying, right, put your money where your mouth is. You're the one who've said lack of central government control and law and order has allowed these things to fester. So you're in charge now. You sort it out. But I don't want to stress too much the influence of the Nevilles on that decision, because a lot of other lords thought that York was a better man for the job than Somerset. I don't think we should see it as, oh, he became protector just because of the Nevilles. And in fact, the alliance with the Nevilles was something which was embryonic at that point. So it's not a done deal exactly.
Surely they would have also thought that we said earlier about the spread of York's lands. He had lands throughout the country. So, you know, he had spheres of influence everywhere. So if you want to put somebody in charge, put somebody in charge who has locals under his command already there to take action.
Well, the Beauforts had very little land, actually, and this is another bone of contention, is that Warwick was in dispute with Somerset over land in South Glamorgan. And one thing we know about Warwick is that he was, like most nobles, only to the nth degree, he was pretty keen on ensuring that his land rights were not abused by anybody else.
Yes.
He didn't have a lot of land because he was casual about it. He had a lot of land because he worked at it, more so than most. So if you're Warwick and you've got a choice between Somerset and York as protector, you're thinking, I'm a rival of Somerset in Wales. I don't want him having too much power. Just about everything happens because of land.
Always.
And the amount of land a particular person holds. Okay, so we see the York-Neville alliance taking shape when York is appointed protector, because one of the first things he has to do is appoint a Lord Chancellor. As we said, there was no Lord Chancellor. Government had been in abeyance. And who does he appoint? He appoints his brother-in-law, the Earl of Salisbury, to that post. And he makes Warwick, his cousin, Captain of Calais, which was the only post in English government which had a standing army. There was always a garrison at Calais. Two very, very influential posts went to the Nevilles. And when York dealt with, in inverted commas, the problem between the Percys and the Nevilles, it was the Percys who ended up in prison, who ended up in trouble, and the Nevilles that basically were in the ascendant, which I'm sure is what they had hoped would happen. So we've got York as protector. In a sense, you could say, well, I mean, how does he view that himself? What's his perspective on that? I think it's that I'm there. I'm arrived. I'm where I want to be.
Yeah.
Somerset, he's going to the Tower, and I'm in the position I always thought I should be: senior nobleman in the
Yeah.
country, supporting my king in this case by looking after the country while he's ill, and or looking after his son to ensure a smooth succession.
Yeah, and now I can straighten everything out,
Yeah,
get everything the way I want it,
yeah,
and then we can just govern properly and get England back to where it should be.
yeah. And to be fair, York did not do a bad job in 1454
Mm,
as protector. He was not as partisan as some had feared, but equally he wasn't as effective as some had hoped. And there was still a lot of
mm.
lawlessness. The job, I mean, he'd only been in power for a short time, but the job really wasn't done. He needed longer, therefore, if he was going to be successful from many perspectives, not just his. But Henry VI, with his unerring sense of comic timing, managed in I think it was it January 1455? I think it was January 1455. Henry recovered his
Mm.
senses, and everything went into reverse. So Somerset's back out of the Tower, York's just another member of the council, and so on and so forth. So it's back to square one. If you're York, it's back to square one.
You do wonder if York's position after Henry's recovery would have been better if he'd either executed Somerset or not moved against him in the first place. Because putting him in the Tower basically made an implacable enemy out of Somerset, and he didn't get rid of him.
Yeah, you could argue that, but I think the problem was that he had no legal grounds
Mm,
for executing Somerset. He could say he was a corrupt councillor, he could say, he'd been inept, and so on. But at the end of the day, the rest of the council, the Nevilles included, knew that to execute Somerset, he would have had to have done it when he was protector, and look and think what would have happened then when Henry
yeah.
recovered his wits. I mean, the knives would have been out.
But that's the thing then. So you wonder, why did he put Somerset in the Tower? Because he was making an enemy for himself, and he wasn't actually removing, he wasn't neutralizing the enemy unless Henry stayed catatonic.
Yeah, I think the thing is, and again, it's one of these things that happens with the Wars of the Roses. There are no sides in 1454. There's no sides. You can't have a civil war without sides. There's only one side.
Mm,
So when the king's not in his proper senses, York is in charge. He has the backing of most of the council. He puts Somerset out of reach because he doesn't like him, and he perhaps fears him a little bit, but he can't really act any more severely than that without great censure from the council.
mm,
Somerset's not very popular with the other councillors, but to execute him would be a bridge too far. When the king recovers his faculties, there's still no sides. There's no
yeah.
there's no civil war sides. York is still on the council. The Nevilles are still on the council. I'm not saying everything is hunky dory at all, because it isn't. And obviously Somerset then is out of the Tower, and the rivalry is there.
Mm,
It's evident for all to see. But what happens next is that York can't see any way that he can get rid of Somerset short of violence.
yeah.
The recovery of the king in January 1455 means that Somerset is back, the Queen's influence is back. Although, again, let me say, to dispel another myth, there is absolutely no evidence that the Queen and York did not get on reasonably well during that period of his protectorate.
No, there isn't.
It's just assumed. It's assumed that they were at each other's throats, but that's just not the case. What happens is York challenges the authority of the crown, because how many times is it going to happen? He's going to put Somerset in the Tower. He's going to be taken out again. It's history repeating itself. Warwick is a very powerful force in all this as well, more so than Salisbury, I think. Warwick, again, very powerful nobleman, a rival of Somerset. I think in Warwick's career, he's a man who likes to get things done, sorted. Let's not mess about. Let's deal with it. And so this is a problem in 1455 which won't go away. The rivalry between Somerset on the one hand and York and Warwick on the other is something that won't go away. And the rest of the councillors, to be fair, people like the Duke of Buckingham and Moderick, they're trying to sort things out. They're trying to smooth the troubled waters. And if Warwick and York had wanted those waters to be smoothed, they would have been.
Yes.
But I think basically by spring 1455, there'd been more than enough talking for Warwick's liking. And both sides were building up forces, armed forces, in the expectation that at the very least, they'd need to put pressure on the king one way or another. So there's a king's army and there's a York Neville army. They're not very big at this stage. It's quite low-key stuff because they're not intending to fight a war. If you'd said to the Earl of Warwick in spring 1455, you're going to fight a war against the king involving thousands of men and it's going to last for a long time, he'd have thought you're an idiot. It's not what he wants. Who wants that? What nobleman wants armies traipsing all over his lands, wrecking the place? Nobody in their right mind wants that. But Warwick and York felt they'd run out of rope. They'd run out of things to do to remove Somerset, and there was only one way to remove him. I mean, what you said earlier about why didn't he just execute him? I bet he was wishing that in the spring of 1455, when Somerset was back in the bosom of the court, as it were, and the king was listening to Somerset and the queen. Not just them. Again, to be fair, these things get polarized. Buckingham was very important in trying to moderate what was going on. But I think that by May, you've got these two armed camps. My view is that, for what it's worth, is that Warwick, for one, had already decided what was going to happen. York was still exchanging letters with the king, saying how loyal he was, even on the morning of the Battle of St Albans, what's known as the First Battle of St Albans. It's not much of a battle, more of an assassination, really. But even on that early in that morning, there's still negotiations going on for a settlement. But Warwick is the one, I think, driving what happens next at St Albans. Now, if you look at it objectively from with hindsight, you say, who dies at the Battle of St Albans? The Duke of Somerset, the Earl of Northumberland, and another northern lord, Lord Clifford. So 3 enemies of Warwick and York are taken out. The king himself is wounded as well.
It's a surgical strike, isn't it?
It is, yeah. It's a surgical strike.
They had their targets, and you assume that they told the soldiers who the targets were.
Absolutely, yeah. No, and more important than that, the king must not die. The king must not be harmed, because if he does, he's no longer, the king is now Prince Edward, who's a little boy, so who, you haven't necessarily got control over. So now let's reset. We've got rid of them. We're in control. Our faction, our Neville York faction, is in control. And obviously the Queen has no comeback on that, really. And the other councillors, and this is people often forget that there are loads of other noblemen, churchmen and so on, who are on the King's Council. They're not just ciphers. They're not just sitting around on their hands. Buckingham is an interesting one. Buckingham was sympathetic to York before the First Battle of St Albans. But like Buckingham, a number of councillors felt that they'd been kind of outmaneuvered by York and the Nevilles, and they resented that, I think. So, everything in the garden is by no means rosy for York. But then, in the autumn of 1455, the king has a relapse and is no longer communicative. And of course, in the position of strength that he's in, York is appointed again as protector. Now, during that time of 4 or 5 months, I think, the balance seems to shift somehow. And I'm not sure that anybody really knows how at this point. But by February 1456, when the king is restored to health again, this time pretty much permanently. There seems to be a shift in the people that matter, in their opinions about York and everything else that's gone on. And from then on, through 1457, 58, 59, you've got this split in the government, in the council, and you've got the Queen taking up the mantle of the Duke of Somerset, if you like, as the leader of what historians sometimes call the court party. Obviously, there weren't any political parties, but she is the chief advisor to the king. And yet York is still on the council, the Nevilles are still on the council. So the council is still sort of balanced. But there's this shift which happens over those years, which shows that the Nevilles and York are resented and certainly not entirely supported by other councillors, with the Queen guiding that process until we reach the point where she is strong enough to try and exclude York and the Nevilles from the council, from office, and more than that if possible. Again, it's a matter of perspective. So if you look at it from York's point of view, he's been squeezed out by the Queen. If you look at it from the Queen's point of view, York is a dangerous presence, Warwick is a dangerous presence. They have already killed members of the council that she had trust in, and the king had trust in as well. So why should she not work against these very dangerous councillors and try and isolate them? And it's exactly what she does, which shows actually that she's pretty good at manoeuvring in the council. So that's what happens, basically. That's how we end up with two sides. But even with the two sides we end up with in 1459, the York and Neville axis is still weak. Not all, but the vast majority of the nobility are loyal to Henry VI, and they see York and the Nevilles as a troublesome, possibly very dangerous group. And that's why they support the Queen's action against them, because they do think that these guys are out of order and have already proven that they're out of control.
And you've also got that thought, haven't you, that, okay, so if I suddenly get on the wrong side of them, they're going to send an army against me. So who do they decide that they don't like next?
I think there's no question that York and Neville are the ones that use force first. And is it a surprise? He's already brought an army to London twice in the early 1450s. So it's not something he's ruled out at any point, really. He's resorted to armed force. He might not have used it in 1450 and 1452, but it's always a weapon in the background there. Some of the nobility in 1459 are thinking, yeah, I remember in 1450 when York brought troops to London. That's not right, So I think they had a bit of a long memory on that one and thought, well, he's a dangerous man. He's more trouble than he's worth. But even then, we're not talking about a civil war for the throne. Even York at that point in 1459 is not claiming the throne. And then we have the Battle of Ludford Bridge, which isn't much of a battle really, where York and the Nevilles are all sort of geared up to fight the king's army, and they're basically routed very quickly and with great loss.
Yeah, and they end up having to sail into exile, don't they?
Yeah. York goes to Ireland with Salisbury, and Warwick goes with York's son Edward to Calais. Warwick goes to Calais, he's captain of Calais, and he goes there to raise an army.
At his power base. And of course, York's got lands in Ireland.
Yeah. Something happens after that defeat at Ludlow, at Ludford Bridge. Something happens in the mind of York. A change occurs. He feels, right, I should be in power. Not necessarily king, but I should be in power. I'm not in power. Not only am I not in power, but I'm excluded again. And this time I'm excluded militarily from England. So where does York go from there? Now, if you're the Earl of Salisbury, his brother-in-law, if you're the Earl of Warwick, who's in Calais with Edward, Earl of March, the eldest son of York, if you're them, you're thinking, how do we get back and take control of the council again? That's what you're thinking. York isn't thinking that. Somewhere along the line, in the late 1459, he's thinking, this position can't go on, and I need to ensure that my future is going to be a royal future, if you like. So Warwick and Edward do the dirty work. They come back. They more or less take control of London, the south, certainly. And meanwhile, Richard Duke of York is still in Ireland, pondering, what to do and how to do it. He then arrives in England with great pomp and ceremony, and he progresses to London. And it's regarded as somewhat symbolic that the sword of state is carried ahead of him, or a sword is carried ahead of him, because that's what happens when the king progresses around the country. So maybe that's a clue. I think certainly some observers at the time regard it as a clue, but he comes into London to great acclamation because obviously he's popular there. And again, if you're York, you're sort of basking in this. He's back. He's back more times than he's been away almost.
He's also come through his own lands, hasn't he? He's come through the Mortimer lands to get there. So he'll have had everybody on the Mortimer lands going, yeah, he's back. And everybody buoying up the Duke of York and him thinking, look, everybody loves me, without probably realising that they're his people, so they sort of do.
And I mean, he's pushing against an open door there. So then something happens which is quite unusual, shall we say. He goes to the House of Lords, and I can't remember which lord, but one of them says, I think it might be the Archbishop, says, did you come to see the king? And he puts his hand on the throne. I think this is a symbolic gesture which much has been made of. And I think much was made of it by the lords, who I think were quite shocked. He appears to be sort of physically laying claim to the throne. And I think it becomes quickly very clear to the lords there that they're in a bit of a fix, because at that moment in London, in Westminster, he is the power in the land. But they're loyal to Henry VI. I mean, the loyalty to Henry VI is staggering, considering how bad a king Henry VI was. The personal loyalty just goes on for years, no matter what. And they don't quite get their heads around what's going on. And even Warwick appears to be surprised. Now, remember, he's not been in Ireland with York. He appears to be very surprised by York's move, shall we say, and doesn't support getting rid of Henry VI. So anyway, long story short, in the end, a compromise is hammered out. A compromise which leaves Henry VI as king, but York will be the successor to Henry VI. And this is the first time he's advanced what he regards as his superior claim to the throne, which is the reason he wants to disinherit Henry's young son. So this thing called the Act of Accord is passed. Accord is not an entirely appropriate word for it, but the Act of Accord is passed in Parliament, which says that Henry VI will live out his natural life unless an accident befalls him, and York will succeed him, and then York's heirs will succeed to the throne, totally disinheriting the lawful prince of the realm, young Prince Edward. And it's a bad compromise, but you can see, and what are the lords supposed to do at that point of time? This doesn't commit them to the settlement. It just means they make the settlement.
No, it's just a way of appeasing York, and we'll sort it later. It doesn't mean anything. Henry VI isn't dying anytime soon.
Well, the only thing it means is that York's superior claim to the throne is enshrined in an Act of Parliament for the first time.
Is recognised.
That is significant, obviously, but it doesn't mean everybody's going to go along with it. And of course, Margaret's not going to go along with it. I mean, she's fighting for the interests of her son, and good luck to her. I can't really see what else she's supposed to do. So again, we have a potential split of two sides. And again, it's the York-Neville axis against a lot of the nobility, certainly the majority, no question about that. The majority of the nobility are still loyal to Henry VI and think that he's been stitched up by the Act of Accord. They may have agreed to it themselves, but they don't think it's the right thing to do. And as a result, they vote with their feet.
Well, it's the old adage as well, isn't it? It goes against the laws of inheritance. If you can disinherit the son of the king, then everybody's inheritance is in question. And as we said a number of times in this podcast, land was really important, the most important thing, and the right to pass that land to your son. If the king can't pass the land to his son, then who can guarantee anybody passing their lands to their son? So
I mean, that's the point really where we move in 1460, this is when we move to what you could more accurately describe as a civil war. So we're in October 1460 when the Act of Accord is passed, because York takes ages to come back to England in the first place. Whether he's pondering over at great length over what he's going to do, I don't know, but it certainly takes a long time. But October 1460, the line is drawn, and you're either for York or you're against him. And it's pretty simple at that point. In 1455, at the First Battle of St Albans, there was nothing simple about it at all for nobles. They weren't sure quite what to do, what was going on, who to support, who not to support. In 1460, it's crystal clear. You are either supporting the ongoing dynasty of Henry VI, or you are supporting York, and you have to make a choice. You can't sit on the fence. So that's a big difference there. So York may have got in Parliament approval for his succession after Henry VI, but he's now got to fight for it. Margaret is whipping up royal support. She has her son with her, and Henry's still the figurehead of government. He's still king. Nobody's arguing about that. And he's in London, but he is very much a prisoner of Warwick, who really controls London at that point. So battle lines are drawn. The Queen is raising an army in the north, where there is obviously a lot of support from the Percys, who are the inveterate enemies of the Nevilles, but also a lot of support from other northern lords. And she also gets support from the Scots. If England's in turmoil, that's good news for Scotland, basically. But I mean, we shouldn't overplay the Scots at this point. There's a northern army for the Queen, if we like. We might as well call her the Queen rather than saying it's for Henry VI. It is for Henry VI, but he's the head of the whole government in London, so it's confusing. She's raised an army. She's got a lot of nobles on her side. They are flocking to her. She's also calling for troops to be raised elsewhere in the country, in Wales, in the southwest, and so on. So she's taking charge of, if you like, the royalist war effort. York and Salisbury go north. So obviously the Nevilles have got considerable resources in the north, and York has some. So they go north to try and counter the Queen's army. And they leave Warwick in London, and Edward, Earl of March, or York's eldest son, goes to Ludlow to raise troops there. His second son, Edmund, is with him in the north. And that's the situation at the end of 1460. And of course, as I'm sure probably everybody knows, the end of 1460 is also the end of the Duke of York. So his death is somewhat surprising in a way, because he is in Sandal Castle. It's a York Neville army that is there. It's not a large army. They're wintering there, aren't they?
I saw figures. Did it say? I think it said it was about 5,000 strong. I think
but
I read.
Are you going to get 5,000 people inside Sandal Castle?
That's my argument. Every time I go to Sandal Castle, I'm like, there is no way you can get 5,000 people inside this castle. 500 maybe at a squeeze, but it's not a big stronghold.
Yeah, they're wintering there. They may well have forces locally, billeted locally perhaps, and in total they may have 1,000 or two, but not 1,000 or 2,000 men literally standing there, armed to the teeth, to fight.
Yeah.
And also the other thing is, again, numbers are always exaggerated in this period. The Queen didn't have tens of thousands of men.
No.
It's winter. It's December in the north.
It is an odd battle, though, because it's like, well, Richard was caught unawares, and it's like, I've stood at the top of the motte at Sandal, and you can practically see Pontefract, which is where the Queen was coming from. Now, if you've got a tower on top of that motte, you would definitely be able to see Pontefract.
Yeah, but there was a lot of forest land that isn't any longer forest land.
There is a lot of forest.
And that one of the several versions of why York came out is that he didn't realise that within this woodland there were more of Margaret's troops, and that he was lured out. That's another part of the legend. Nobody knows. No. Nobody's ever going to know why York came out of the castle, where he was perfectly secure, and decided, I don't know, to get supplies or whatever. Yes, it was winter. Yes, they're probably short of supplies. for the numbers they had. And that's, your point of there would be hundreds probably inside the castle. If the castle wasn't prepared for a winter with that number, they would have needed more supplies.
There's also the suggestion that there was a Christmas truce and that it was broken, or that you thought there was a Christmas truce, but you would have worked out, you would have made sure of that, wouldn't you?
Most of the stories are rubbish, to be honest. Most of the stories come afterwards anyway, and it's a propaganda thing, really. Oh well, why did he come out?
Yeah.
That was an idiot thing to do. No, he was lured out. Otherwise, he wouldn't have done it, because he's a very clever man. So it depends which side you're trying to represent as doing something sensible, or wanting to denigrate, produces these stories. Anyway, the upshot is, he's killed. We think he's killed fighting, but who knows? Again, different legends say he was killed. Others say he was grievously wounded and then executed, and so on and so forth. Salisbury was captured and later executed. Well, actually, I think he was killed by some of the commoners. But again, it's all a bit hazy. York's second son, Edmund, was also killed. But again, the circumstances are open to question.
Yeah.
It's said that he was killed by Lord Clifford, who was the son of the Clifford who was killed at the Battle of St Albans, and it was revenge killing. Who knows? Could be. I've no idea. Shakespeare has kind of immortalised Edmund, who was the Earl of Rutland, and he there are various expressions of grief at the death of this innocent young lad, the tender age of 17?
Yeah.
At the age of 17, when you've been trained in military combat, you ain't a boy, basically.
No.
You may be a young man, but you know what you're doing. You know the sharp end of the sword and so on. So, that Shakespeare's sort of moving tribute to the Earl of Rutland is somewhat misplaced.
And he'd been involved in the events at least since Ludford Bridge, when he was taken to Ireland with his father. He was considered old enough to fight.
Yeah, and the other thing is that he and his elder brother Edward, there was only a year or so between them, and they had been together a lot. They'd been raised together. They'd been raised as his heirs. There's no question about that. They'd been trained in warfare and so on. Those two brothers, and I think the loss of Edmund is actually more serious for later than it is then.
Yes, definitely.
It was a big loss to Edward that he didn't have his younger brother with him. But anyway, the upshot is that York is killed. His head is put along with the others on the Micklegate bar at York and generally ridiculed. So it's not a good end, really, for Richard, Duke of York.
No, and it's not the end of the Wars of the Roses. It's just the end of Richard, Duke of York.
Yeah, it's kind of the beginning of the Wars of the Roses.
Yes,
actually.
Yeah, most of the battles come afterwards, don't they?
They do, and also, as long as Richard, Duke of York is still alive, the Act of Accord has kind of papered over the cracks, and he can claim he's acting for the king and so on. But once Richard, Duke of York is killed, it's harder for his son to argue on the same lines, and really it forces him to go for the throne directly. Yeah, that's another story, as they say. In some ways, when you think about York's career, I think there's an inevitability about York's end somehow. For me, we posed the question, was he a loyal lord or a traitorous knave? Well, he was definitely both.
He's definitely both. I think the thing that surprised me was, I think the way he's portrayed in literature, in historical fiction, it's like his destiny is always for the crown.
Yes, exactly. Yes, which it wasn't.
But when
really.
you look at his action, he wasn't looking for the crown. He was looking for recognition for his rightful place in government rather than at the head of the government. He wanted to be the leading nobleman of the country. He wanted to be the king's chief advisor because he believed that was his right.
Yes, it's only after the disaster of 1459 and having to flee the country, it's only then, I think, that he seriously thinks, right, okay, there is only one course of action left, which will get me into a position of control. And he takes that, but he's on his own, really. He's got three fundamental flaws in his makeup. One, this absolute belief in his own cause.
Yes.
That is unshakable. He believes he should be in control. That's the beginning and end of it. And that is an attitude which tends to alienate others. So he's not a guy who's going to bring in others to get their support and put an arm around them and say, yeah, let's do this with your bit of the country or whatever. He puts people off to some extent. An element of that is that he doesn't actually care whether they agree with him or not, because he believes he must be right.
Yeah.
He is right. It is his birthright. But a second, I think, terrible flaw is his willingness to break the law to get what he wants. And he does it time after time. He breaks the law. He raises armed forces to bully the king and others. It's a trait that goes right the way through what he does.
And that's a good point, actually, that he is a bully.
He is a bully. Now, you could say that someone like Warwick is a bully, but there's a major difference between the two. Richard has got no charisma at all. Zero charisma. Nobody will be swayed by Richard, Duke of York, saying, come on, lads, let's do this. Now, if the Earl of Warwick says, come on, lads, let's do this, you're off. And similarly with Edward, Earl of March. If he says, right, we're going to do this, okay, let's do it. Richard, Duke of York, well, really? He's got a charisma bypass going on there. And while I'm offending people, let's offend a few Ricardians. His son, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, is exactly the same. He has the same flaws. He resorts to force when he doesn't have to. He breaks the law if it's in his interests, and he has no charisma. And there we are. I'm sure I've offended quite a few people with that. But as far as I'm concerned, that's it. That's why it goes wrong for Richard of Gloucester as well. Exactly the same problems. The idea that he could have ruled well, I think, is very unlikely. But we could be wrong, of course. Could have been the greatest king ever, couldn't he? Possibly. Who knows? That's history for you.
That he was.
No, in our view, it's unlikely. For me, York's legacy is a terrible one. Because of what York had done, because of St Albans, because of what happened afterwards, because of his own death, really, and because of the Act of Accord, whoever was in control after that would have bigger problems, and they would have constantly to deal with rebellions and opposition caused by this fracturing of the state in the 1450s. So the legacy, I think, of Richard, Duke of York was a pretty terrible one. And I don't think he deserves much credit, really, for what he does. So that's offended a whole swathe of Yorkist supporters around the world.
He was a loyal lord to a point. He
did his duty, in a sense, in France, but he'd got no rewards for it, and he was being taken for a ride, and he didn't like that. But, he's not the king.
No.
So that happened to lots of nobles throughout the Middle Ages. They may have wanted more, but sometimes they didn't get it because the king wasn't prepared to give it. So that was life.
And he did have a high opinion of his own abilities.
He did. If you start to believe your own propaganda, it's a dangerous and slippery slope, I think.
I think we have answered the question, loyal lord or traitorous knave, a bit of both. But in the end, he did betray his king. That's been fascinating, Derek. I've learned an awful lot.
If anyone wants to find out more, my book, A Guide to the Wars of the Roses, will be out later in the year, published by Pen and Sword. We'll put a little plug in there.
I haven't got a book about the Wars of the Roses. No, so we'll just go with yours.
Yeah.
Thank you very much to everyone for listening. I hope we've given you something to think about and a good background, I think, to the start of the Wars of the Roses.
Yeah.
Join us next week when we are going rogue. And we're going really rogue. Can we say that? Really rogue.
Yeah, we're going incredibly rogue.
We are, because we're going to America and the women of the American Revolution with Samantha Wilcoxon. So do join us next time, because I think that's going to be fascinating. I've been Sharon Bennett Connolly.
And I'm Derek Birks. Thanks very much for listening. We hope you've enjoyed the podcast. And if you have, it'd be good if you could give us a review. And you might want to subscribe to the podcast to ensure you don't miss one.